B. Funding for Firing Line is made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Annenberg Foundation and the Friends of Firing Line.
The design of this program and the succeeding program is to explore the role of language in journalism. George Orwell wrote an essay that became famous in which he pointed to the misuse of language by the tyrants who reigned in Europe as he wrote. There is an endless debate within America about the function of language, about its changes, the rules that govern its use. My own book, Buckley, the Right Word, has been criticized by one of our guests for violating what he deems a critical role in journalism, namely to avoid the use of any word that might confuse the reader. I speak of James Jackson Kilpatrick, the syndicated columnist, a sometime editor of the Richmond News Leader, and for our purposes, most important, author of The Writer's Art, a classic book on the use of language. Our second guest is the renowned film and drama critic, John Simon. He was born in Yugoslavia and came to America about the time of Pearl Harbor, going on to receive a BA and a doctorate at Harvard. He is the drama critic of New York Magazine and film critic of National Review, author of 10 books, including Paradigms Lost, Reflections on Literacy and Its Decline. We should, I think, begin by asking the basic question, namely, why is illiteracy growing? What can he have meant when, in the closing days of the campaign, President Clinton said that he intended to wipe out illiteracy by the end of the century? Mr. Kilpatrick, if you were czar, how would you go about wiping out illiteracy?
Oh, I would suggest that every student be compelled to read my books on the subject, and we could probably go on from there. To wipe out an illiteracy bill requires resources in the public school system that I don't believe exist. I don't think you're going to wipe it out. I'm very pessimistic about it, and I expect my distinguished colleague is also.
Well, there's a book recently published which fondles or rather gags over the thesis that the age of literacy will be viewed 100 years from now as something that happened between the 15th and the 20th century. Why should there be more illiteracy now than there was, say, 40 years ago?
Bill, I don't believe that the public schools, and for all I know the private schools also, are teaching the fundamentals of grammar, spelling, syntax, literacy in ways that were taught in the early 1900s or on up to my boyhood. I was born in Oklahoma City in 1920. Now, this was not exactly the Athens of the Midwest, you understand. And yet I had a far better education in the fundamentals, Latin in the middle school, for example, than is available in most public school systems today. We've gone down, not up, in teaching literacy.
I saw you nodding your head, which means that Mr. Simon agrees, which is very unusual. So I have to profit here on this and ask you, as Mr. Kilpatrick would put it in his column, cui bono, who profits from not teaching people how to read?
Well,
what satisfaction do the teachers get from it?
Well, those teachers who, like most teachers nowadays, don't know themselves what they're supposed to teach. Obviously, if you have illiterates teaching literacy, they profit from not teaching, as they couldn't possibly from doing something they can't do.
Now, wait a minute. You're not suggesting that the teachers don't know how to read.
Oh, they know how to read, maybe, but you know, that's the problem with things like illiteracy. It is widely assumed that because someone can pick up a book and slowly make out the words on the page, that's literacy. That's the barest beginning of something. You have to be able to read fluently, with comprehension, with participation in what you're reading, and with the ability to digest that and put it to some kind of use. Then you are literate.
Now, let's really fine-tune this. Are you telling me that the teachers in Oklahoma City today read only as haltingly as Mr. Simon suggests?
I wouldn't know anything on earth about the teachers in Oklahoma City today. I can extrapolate from what I've read about public school teaching across the country that, yes, the teachers in our public schools probably are less well-trained, certainly in the areas that interest me, in the classics, in grammar, in spelling, in composition, in all these things. I don't believe they're taught that much today.
Let's assume, are you talking about their own inability to read, or are you talking about their inability to teach others how to read? It's different, obviously.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. I assume that every teacher in Oklahoma City can read.
Well, and he says only halting.
Well, yeah, minimally. But there are many things. I think one of the big problems is that most teachers now are products of schools of education, which are famous for not teaching you anything. They teach you something like good citizenship or whatever. Deportment.
And they get that wrong, too, don't they?
Yeah, right.
Posture.
Yeah, and and schools of education, as has been pointed out by many, do not really teach. In the old days, in order to teach, you had to learn some discipline well, usually English. But I don't care if it was history, I don't care if it was geography, something that you really had to learn by hard attention and work. But if you breeze through a school of education and you know about all kinds of theories of education and theories of what to teach and what not to teach, you end up not knowing any one subject, and you have no sense of what it means to roll up your sleeves and come to grips with some discipline that demands understanding.
Well, to what extent does either one of you hold the so-called look-see method of reading as responsible for this backwardness?
Disaster. Absolute disaster. When they got away from phonics, Bill, it's been downhill from that
Would you
moment on.
explain the difference between the two?
Oh, you look and guess. In one textbook I remember reading some years ago, you identified a D because it had the mask going up, and you identified a P because it had something going down. The idea of learning the sounds of words was absolutely divorced from this particular textbook. In phonics, I can remember learning C-O-N, con. One of the highlights of my life was when one of my grandchildren, to please grandfather, learned to spell Constitution phonetically. It was a
The
great moment.
Constitution, the Supreme Court hasn't done that, has it?
No, they certainly interpret it wrongly, but they spell it rightly.
Yeah. Well, now, okay. Now, what is the attraction of this awkward substitute? Why do teachers gravitate to teaching in a method that doesn't work?
I suppose it's simpler for them in some way, Bill. I continue to hear from teachers who say, oh, we are not totally divorced from phonics, you understand. We're teaching both together. And I hear this over and over, and perhaps it's true, but perhaps the look and guess method is easier to teach, or there are certain people who believe it is more effective. I don't believe it's more effective.
Well, on the look-see, how would you teach a student to read the word giraffe?
Well, you would have a picture of the giraffe to begin with, and under it in large letters you would have giraffe. They would look at the picture and they would memorize. The two F's would create a certain visual image that would be helpful to them. They would look at the two F's and perhaps say, that's sound, I don't know. I'm a long way away from this.
That's the subject. Is there an ideology of illiteracy? If so, how do you account for it?
You see, I think the big difference is that our society has changed in its basic values. It is no longer a question of learning, it's no longer a question of knowledge, it's a question of money and success. Everything is goal-oriented in the shabbiest, most materialistic sense. Nothing is oriented towards becoming an educated person, towards becoming a cultivated, civilized human being, any kind of knowledge that isn't immediately translatable into dollars and cents is of no use, to be swept under the carpet or thrown out with the garbage, whereas anything that's going to get you a better job, that's going to make you more money, that's going to make you more famous perhaps, that counts and nothing else.
I'm familiar with that criticism, as undoubtedly you are, but what I can't understand is that it should commend itself to the majority of people who devote their entire lives to teaching. If you devote your life to teaching somebody to be a doctor, you want him to end up knowing how to pull out the appendix. If you devote your life to teaching language or English, you want your students to learn how to read fluently.
Yeah.
So why would this ideological distraction preoccupy them?
Well, look at today's doctors. They don't know how to do their job either. A right leg comes in bad shape and they amputate the left leg.
Now, John,
we know that.
You're very funny, but that isn't true.
No, this is an actual case from the newspaper.
Well, an actual case doesn't mean it happens in Oklahoma City every day.
Well, no, Oklahoma City is above.
We're using that as a synecdoche.
You are. Don't
Yes.
knock Oklahoma City. Bill, are those of us who write for a living done for in, I mean, you're a computer whiz-bang. You live by browsing the internet. Am I done for as a newspaper man when this millennium comes upon us? Will there be newspapers? Will there be good writing?
Well, whether there are newspapers, it seems to me, is irrelevant to the question of whether people read. And if they, however much they depend on the internet in order to exploit it, they got to know how to read. Isn't that correct?
Well, true enough. Whether newspapers continue to exist is not exactly irrelevant to me, because I've been writing for newspapers for 56 years. Do we all learn to read off the screen in the future, Bill?
My answer to that is I don't see any difference between reading from the screen and reading from a book, by which I mean the eyes perform a certain exercise, the brain does the necessary transcription, and you proceed with the next sentence. It seems to me an awkward substitute. But I don't think that this cybernetic revolution is nearly as damaging as the television revolution of 40 years ago, because it's not so passive, is it?
But what about writing? You speak about reading, but what about the young person writing? He has this machine writing it has spell check, which means he doesn't have to know the first thing about spelling.
You're quite wrong, because...
the spell check makes mistakes, I realize.
Yeah.
That, but he doesn't know that it
And the
makes
spell check
mistakes.
gives you choices. Let's say you write still with just one L. Now, the spell check is going to give you 5 words that you might have meant stilt.
Stilt.
Or stilled. You have to say which one you want. You don't know which one you want. You got to know which is the correct spelling of the word you intended, right?
Well, a lot of guesswork enters into it. The point is that when the writing sat in a pen, which sat in your hand, and your hand, which was connected clearly to your brain, then there was input, to use a ghastly word. Then there was involvement. Then there was commitment to the word that was coming out. But when you just sort of run your fingers over a keyboard and all kinds of approximate things seem just as good as the Ding an sich, the thing itself, then I think superficiality comes in, then casualness, and finally non-caring comes in. Because, of course, the idea is just to communicate any old way. It's enough that the person understands your drift. It doesn't matter that you said something.
But that's a purely utilitarian concept of language.
It is, and it's deplorable.
My point is, even on internet, if you want to communicate something to somebody at the other end, there's a difference between saying, I cherish you, I admire you, I love you. You got to make those distinctions. So there isn't a way in which all of those gradations can be subsumed into a single word, is there?
Yes.
relieving you of the obligations of language?
These fine distinctions, and they're really not all that fine, but they are distinctions, hardly exist for the average person today. To him or her, cherish or esteem or respect or like or enjoy are practically interchangeable. And what made them less interchangeable were a lot of things that no longer exist. It was learning etymology, for example, and knowing what the difference really is between cherish and love or like or esteem. It meant practice in fairly advanced reading and seeing what good writers do with those words. It meant having to write compositions that were severely graded if you were doing badly, and therefore having to look up words and study their meanings and so on. When none of this is of any importance anymore, then approximate things are fine. And why should the person using the machine know whether cherish or love or like are different? They're sort of generally the same thing. My point gets across. What else matters?
I think there are degrees of communication. The average reader of a newspaper, Bill, would know the difference between respect, like, adore. These are not unfamiliar words. These are perfectly familiar words. They're gradations of affection, from passion down to something close to indifference. I think they're well-known, well-respected. What's the problem here? We're communicating.
Let me give you a figure I recently ran into, which is that Berkeley in California is one of the most difficult colleges to get into. You got to score real high in high school aptitudes and SATs. Right? Once you get in there, 50% need to take courses in remedial reading. Now, we're talking about people with high intelligence. People with high intelligence would not confuse cherish and...
You rely on that statistic?
Well, it's a very damaging statistic.
If true.
It's a very damaging statistic to
But Bill,
students.
Isn't it true that the tough entrance requirements are for Oriental Americans, Chinese American students? They're not for African American students. For them, it is much easier to get into any of those places, including Berkeley.
You mean under affirmative action?
Yeah. So that the high discriminatory standard at the entrance exam only works against one segment of the population, which is considered to be overqualified and is therefore judged very harshly. Whereas another segment, which is rightly or wrongly considered underqualified, is judged laughably easily.
Well, it seems to me you're making what the lawyers call an admission against interest, because you leveled very general comprehensive charges against illiteracy almost everywhere, but now you're saying that illiteracy is primarily confined to certain groups who have special difficulties at school. It seems to me that
Functional
from reading
illiteracy certainly is. The inability to read the simplest things.
well, that's supposed to be up to 20 or 30%, isn't it?
25 was the last I heard, but all right, 20, 30, any old percentage you want. I distrust all statistics.
That's the fault of Democratic presidents?
Well, certainly. Absolutely. No question about it.
Well, I wouldn't give you 2 cents for the English of Republican presidents either.
Well, but let me ask you, what is the corrective engine that we can assume operates to protest this situation and do something about it? The dissatisfaction of grandparents over their grandchildren's lack of language interest?
I know of no engine to correct this, Bill. Do you? Paradigms are all the way long.
You're a free market man, aren't you? What is the free market engine? You got to learn how to write before you get a newspaper job, don't you?
Yeah. Though not necessarily these days, Bill. Not necessarily. The mistakes that are made in our daily newspapers are absolutely appalling.
Yeah, in the New York Times to start.
Yeah, even the New York Times. They've messed up on qualities today in this morning's New York Times.
Oh, I read a piece the other day by Paul Goldberger, who is one of their fancy architecture critics and culture critics. In 3 paragraphs, there were 3 whopping mistakes in just 3 short paragraphs.
And is it because he didn't know or because he was in a hurry?
I think it's because he didn't know. It's the kind of mistakes one makes out of mistake one makes out of ignorance. As, for example, when he says, he is one of those writers who knows.
The singular, yeah.
That's
yeah.
ignorant.
Yeah.
That's ignorant.
But the
And
ignorance
that's the
figures
biggest
into it.
general mistake.
It's one of
Maybe,
them.
yeah.
There are many others, unfortunately.
One of my readers sent me a flyer from the Olympia, Washington Symphony Orchestra trying to raise funds. Tell you what it would mean to support the orchestra. You will bring in international talent, artists who shape and innervate.
And what?
And innervate.
So much for that fundraising.
So there's a great deal of ignorance out there. They just get the wrong words clued in all the time, Bill.
Well, let me say this on the other side, which is that I read the usual journals, and I think on the whole, the writing standards are terrific. I mean, they're just awfully good. Time, Newsweek, the
some
New
are
York
excellent.
Times.
Some are absolutely first rate.
Yeah.
Mr. Simon's reviews. I love them.
Oh, because he's special, yeah.
Yeah.
But they're not in Time or Newsweek.
No, but they're a National Review, and that's where...
Well, that's more important.
Yeah, but the
there's some first-rate
I'm
stuff
asking
out
a
there.
very serious question. When things go wrong, we like to hope that there are mechanisms in our culture that address that delinquency and seek to do something about it. I mean, if for instance, it turned out that nurses were poisoning their patients because they didn't wash their hands, there would be a movement to make nurses wash their hands. Now, where is such a movement addressing the language problem?
I don't think it's in the Internet.
Why?
I just, well, you know more about the Internet than I do, but I just don't see this as a mechanism for fighting illiteracy. Am I wrong in that, Bill?
Well, colleges are competitive. Colleges have competitive standards for 18-year-olds, and presumably they will give an advantage to people who can write sentences, right?
Coherent?
So isn't that a market mechanism that says to the high schools, if you want your kids to make out, teach them how to write?
Yeah, but competitiveness is also a relative term. In former times, it could have meant you don't get to Harvard or Yale unless you get 98 out of 100 on this test. Now, if the best person only gets 58 out of 100, then that person gets into Yale and Harvard. So,
John, the SATs, I happen to know this because 3 days ago somebody told me, the SATs going to Yale now are 100 points higher than they were when I went there.
yeah,
Now,
but,
the people are more literate now.
but
and
what
better-
are the words or the questions asked on these SATs? That's the
Well, are you suggesting that the SATs have in fact low? I know they did a year ago, but in the preceding 45 years ago,
Well, my
do you
guess
think
is
that
that
standards lowered?
my guess is the difference is that, say, 40 years ago, they wanted you to define something like, sesquipedalian. Now they want to define cat. And if you can get that right,
You ruin your case by exaggerating. You
well,
really
I'm
do.
trying to make it more graphic, that's all.
In the first place, let me tell you this. Nobody completes his language SAT, by which I mean the answers that are required and the length of the exam is so large that even Mr. Young Genius doesn't finish. He doesn't have time. So therefore, it's got to exhaust something more than what is a cat and how is a cat different from an elephant.
Sure. Feline, how's that? No, but it's what would change things is a radical change of outlook, of values, of goals, of ideals. This is not going to happen. This cannot be created by a fiat. It has to come from some vast historic, cultural, political change. If there were a cataclysm, if Attila and his Huns were to overrun us and destroy us, and we had finally to pick ourselves up out of the mud and really start relearning things from the ground up, that would make a change. But that's a pretty bitter cure, worse perhaps than the illness.
You may go at it incrementally, Bill, by trying to get state boards of education to reintroduce into the public school system such elementary tools as diagramming a sentence, to reintroduce Latin. And the study of foreign languages well taught, if you could do politically, to get your state legislatures and then your local school boards motivated to do these things, possibly you
Yes,
might make
yes,
some
but
incremental changes.
yes, but nowadays the other language is not Latin. The other language is Ebonics. It's Black English. I mean, if those are the two languages, then you're worse off than you are with one.
Well, if you had to suggest a procedural reform, would the best one be to simply refuse to graduate a student who hadn't, in fact, qualified for graduation?
Oh, Bill, I think you have to give them some sort of farewell letter. Otherwise, the big hunks grow it to be 18, 19, 20. They've not out of high school. What do you do with them? No, I don't think you can do that.
Well, what do they do them in Europe? They go to vocational schools, right?
You know, we don't have that here, and I wish we did.
But if in fact you set objective standards and insisted they be met, that would be a step. I've asked you a question, which I'm not going to give you time to reply to. Thank you, Mr. Kilpatrick, Mr. Simon, ladies and gentlemen.
Next week on Firing Line, William F. Buckley Jr. and his guests conclude their conversation on language and journalism, with emphasis on using the right word. This program was a Warren Steibel production in association with South Carolina ETV. Funding for Firing Line was made possible